and welcome to Parshat Vayera. So I also need to tell you from a logistical point of view, there is no class next week. We're actually going away. We're going, ironically, on a cruise that is all about Geula. So I'm going to be, there's going to be a bunch of different presentations, Torah classes and so forth. And I'm going to be teaching about you guys, not you specifically, but about the phenomenon of non-Jewish people interested in Torah, because my audience is like 50 or 60 religious people from Israel who don't know about people like you. And so I'm going to be introducing them to what's going on. I'm very excited about that, because I also feel, as you know, very much that it's connected to redemption. It's connected to Geula. But I want to tell you that the Torah portion next week is called Vayera. It's from the book of Genesis, chapter 23, all of 23, all of 24, and 25 until including verse 18. That's next week. So what I may do, so Vayera is actually where we really learn the story of Rivka. So I really hate missing that one because I love sharing that story. But maybe I'll do what I did a couple of weeks ago when I did Bereshit and Noach together. I'll think about that. You can let me know in the WhatsApp group what you prefer. But for now, let's focus on Vayera. Okay, so now we are in the book of Genesis, chapter 18, verse 1 through chapter 22, verse 24. All of these Torah portions are so unbelievably packed, that we really could spend so weeks and weeks and weeks on each one. But as I have been doing and as I will continue to do, I found a few things that I wanted to focus on. But let's do the summary first, okay? Here's everything that happens in this parsha. So the name of the parsha, Vayera, literally means "and he appeared." And it's found in the book of Genesis, chapter 18, verse 1. I think I told you this, but I'm going to repeat it again, that the Torah portion, the name of the Torah portion usually comes from the first significant word in the first verse. Okay. So who appeared? God appeared. So here's the summary. God reveals himself to Abraham 3 days after his circumcision. So Abraham's 99 years old. It's a super hot day. He's sitting in the tent with all four sides open. And God appears to him, and the rabbis say, what was God doing? And they say he was visiting the sick, because I think we talked about this. Circumcision as an adult is like a major medical procedure, and how much more so, like without any anesthesia, without anything. And so Abraham is recovering, and seemingly while they are speaking, while God is speaking to Abraham, he rushes off to prepare a meal for three guests that have suddenly appeared in the desert heat. One of the three, they are all angels disguised as men. So at this point, Abraham thinks that they are men. And one of them announces that in exactly a year from that time, Sarah, who is barren and is 89 years old at this point, is going to give birth to a son. And this is the famous episode where Sarah laughs. God, next little section, God informs Abraham of his plan to destroy Sodom. Sodom, you probably call it Sodom, where is the city where Lot went when Abraham separated and said to Lot, look, you have too many cattle, I have too many cattle, our herdsmen are getting into fights. You go one way, I'll go another. And so Lot goes to Sodom in the area of the Dead Sea. And there's a famous passage where Abraham pleads with God to spare the city, even though the city is terribly wicked. And we'll talk about that a lot more later on. Two of these three angels, who are disguised as men, go to Sodom, to the house of Lot, and Lot extends his hospitality to them. He does not yet know that they are angels, and protects them from the mob scene. And we'll talk more about this. The two guests reveal that they've come to overturn Sodom and to save Lot and his family. Lot's wife, as they are escaping, turns into a pillar of salt. We'll talk more about that when she disobeys the command not to look back at the burning city as they run away. Okay, now they're out of the city, and the wife is a pillar of salt. So the only ones left are Lot and his two unmarried daughters. And while taking shelter in a cave, Lot's two daughters, who believe that they and their father are the only human beings left alive in the world, they get their father drunk, they lie with him, and they both become pregnant. And they both have sons, and the two sons who are born from them are become the fathers of nations. One is Moab, which may ring a bell because that is connected to, who's that connected to? Somebody unmute yourself and say what nation, what famous person is connected to the nation of Moab?
Ruth.
Ruth, exactly. Okay. And the nation of Ammon, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Then after that, Abraham moves to Gerar, which is a Philistine city in sort of south central Israel, where the king of this area is Abimelech. He takes Sarah, who is once again, just like the story we heard last time, presented as Abraham's sister to his palace. But this time in a dream, God warns Avimelech that he's going to die unless he returns Sarah to her husband. And Abraham once again says, well, I lied because I was afraid that you would kill me and take my wife. So much happens in this parsha. God remembers his promise to Sarah that was spoken by the angels. She has a son whose name is you call him Isaac, Yitzchak, which is a verb that means he will laugh. He is circumcised at the age of 8 days. At this point, Abraham is 100 years old. Sarah is 90 when Yitzchak is born. Then we have the section of Hagar and Ishmael are banished from Abraham's home and they wander in the desert. God hears the cry of the. Now, it's interesting that Ishmael, does anybody want to take a guess how old Ishmael is at this point? If you don't know, if you know, don't say. But like, what is your impression in this story of like how old he is? Approximately. Anybody?
Is he 13?
13.
Okay. He's
Oh,
actually 27. He,
whoa.
but the text talks about him as if he was a young boy. But if you remember, he was circumcised at the age of 13 when Abraham was circumcised. Okay. And um, so this banishment doesn't happen right away. Okay. But in any case, God hears the cry and saves his life by showing his mother a well. Avimelech also makes a treaty with Abraham at Beersheba, where Abraham gives him 7 sheep as a sign of their truce. And then comes the big episode, which we're not going to talk about at all, of God testing Abraham's devotion by commanding him to sacrifice Yitzhak on the Har HaBayit, on the Temple Mount, what is called Mount Moriah in Yerushalayim. And Yitzhak is bound and placed on the altar. Abraham raises the knife to slaughter his son. A voice calls from heaven to tell him to stop. And instead, he sacrifices a ram in his place. Okay, that's the overview. Now, the part of this, the part of this story that I really, two parts of the story that I really want to focus on is the episodes with the daughters of Lot. I want to go into a deep dive, and also the rest of the story of Hagar and Ishmael. Okay, so that's where we're going. So according to the rabbis, Lot had actually four, possibly five daughters, but at this point, one of them died. At this point in the story, he's got two married daughters and two unmarried daughters. The two married daughters and their husbands and the two unmarried daughters are also engaged at the time that the angels come to tell Lot, get out of Dodge because I'm going to destroy all of this. So Lot goes to his sons-in-law and he says, I got this message. We got to get out of here. And his sons-in-law basically laugh at him and say, we're not going anywhere. And so the married daughters stay with them. So the only people that leave are Lot and his wife and the two unmarried daughters. Now, we already talked about the fact that the Lot's two daughters eventually, as the story unfolds, are going to be impregnated by their father. And Brittany, if you're here, I'm sorry that this is another, it's a very sexual episode. You're not going to be able to show this to your kids. But the biblical story presents the daughters as the initiators and the active perpetrators of this act of what is basically incest, that they ply their father with wine, they lay with him when he's intoxicated, and the idea is that Lot doesn't really know what's going on. He's too drunk to know what's going on. And we would expect that the rabbis would condemn the daughters and defend Lot. He was just, I mean, it's true he was drunk, but he didn't he didn't rape his daughters. He didn't go after them. They went to him. But ironically, the rabbis portray the daughters in a favorable light, and Lot is the one who was indicted. Lot is a very confusing character because on the one hand, you probably know this, he is the brother of Sarah, and he has been influenced in many positive ways by living, not at this point in the story, but earlier in his life, he lived in the household, the greater household of Abraham and Sarah, and he picked up a whole bunch of um, good qualities. But according to the Midrash, from the outset, when he decided to settle in Sodom, it's because he knew the reputation of the place and he wanted to engage in the immoral behaviors of its inhabitants. And so that's why he moved there. And there's an earlier incident that I want to go into a little bit more deeply that show the dark side of his character. And that is this. We're now in Bereshit, in Genesis chapter 19. So two of the three angels that were visiting Abraham and Sarah now go to Sodom to warn Lot of the coming destruction. Now, Sodom is a place, one, obviously there's all this illicit sexual stuff going on, but also hospitality is, to say frowned upon in Sodom is like an understatement. Like it's people do not extend hospitality to anybody. It's interesting, on a related note, I'm in the process of working with this family of three men from Mexico who had a conservative conversion in Mexico and the non-halachic, like they're not Orthodox, but they are trying to come to Israel. And in order for them to do that, the Jewish Agency has a rule that if you're a convert to Judaism, you have to spend at least 9 months in a recognized Jewish community outside of Israel, which is totally reasonable. You know, you can't move to Israel the day after you convert. You have to have 9 months in a recognized Jewish community before you can be accepted for Aliyah. The problem is, just like the people in Sodom who don't um, extend hospitality, the Jewish communities in Mexico do not accept converts at all, ever, under any circumstances. So they are not considered part of the community, even though they converted. The community won't let them in. And now, on the positive side, they have a very, very low level of intermarriage in the Jewish community in Mexico. But on the other hand, there's no door in. And that is really not in any way an accurate reflection of the Torah's view towards people who want to join the Jewish people. But that, anyway, that's the situation. I just thought of it because of the parallels. So people are not welcome. Converts are not welcome to join the Jewish community in Mexico. And guests are not welcome in Sodom. Okay. But Lot invites them to stay with him because he was raised in the house of Abraham. And one of Abraham's greatest personality qualities is that he was very hospitable. And so Lot makes them a feast, similar to what Abraham did, even though they're angels and they don't actually really need food. But after pretending to eat and retiring from the night, now the house is surrounded by local people demanding that Lot send out his guests. For what purpose? Because they want to sodomize them. This is actually where the word sodomize comes from Sodom. Okay. Now, Lot refuses to throw his guests to the crowd. And instead, in chapter 19, verse 8, he makes them a different offer. He says, "Behold, now I have two daughters who were not intimate with a man," meaning that they are virgins. "I will bring them out to you to do with them as you see fit. Only to these men do nothing, because they have come under the shadow of my roof." Okay. So we're hearing that. And if you're anything like me, it's a very difficult verse to take in. So I'm going to explain as best I can how the rabbis understood it. So there's one explanation that is to his credit. Okay, so both acts are evil, but um, in the way of understanding it, sodomy is considered a much worse sin than raping a woman, which is at least has and I'm not justifying this in any way, and I hope it's not triggering for anybody because this is hard even for me to say, but at least there's like that's like a natural human act as opposed to sodomy, which is just evil from the word go. So so that's one that his calculation was um to try to prevent the worst of two evils. Also, that he was trying, he says, only to these men do nothing because they have come under the shadow of my roof. He was trying to protect the guests that he invited into his home by sacrificing something of his. Now, he was in a difficult predicament. Now, we probably don't have a whole lot of sympathy for that because what did the girls do? The unmarried daughter. Ginny, do you want to say something? Okay. The unmarried daughters, but in any case, the truth is that the crowd is not satisfied with his offer, so nothing actually happens to them, and they practically break down his door in order to get to the men. Now, the guests, who you know are angels of Hashem, what they do is some angel magic, and they blind all of the people in the mob, so they can't find Lot's door to continue the siege. Okay. And once they do that, now Lot has a clue that these are angelic beings. And so they urge him at this point to flee with his immediate family because Sodom is going to be destroyed. And this is the point at which Lot tried to talk to his sons-in-law, but they didn't take him seriously. And in the end, he left just with his wife and his two unmarried daughters. But the rabbis say that Lot actually, in the end, he had to be physically dragged out by the angels because he was delaying trying to save some of his possessions. For those of you that are connected to me on Facebook, I don't know, I wrote about this a couple of days ago as I was preparing this class because I thought this sounds a whole lot like the Jews outside of Israel, the Jews in Europe, the Jews in North America, the wherever they are, that there's trouble brewing and they're not coming because they are very attached to their material possessions. That was the analogy that I was trying to make. But anyway, um, basically the angels take them and plant them in a small city close by that the Torah calls Zoar. And along the way, this is the famous part where Lot's wife looks back at the destruction, despite being warned not to. So the angels say, come with us, and whatever you do, don't look back. And she turns into a pillar of salt. This is one before I knew anything about the Bible, in any kind of serious way, before I was studying myself. This is like one of those things that's in popular culture, this idea that the wife of Lot looked back and she turned into a pillar of salt. By the way, the Bible doesn't mention her name, but the rabbis refer to her as Edith. Edith. Okay, now let's get into this a little bit more. Why a pillar of salt? So there's a concept in Torah called Mida Keneged Mida, which means that God punishes in proportion to or according to what the sin is. So if Lot's wife turned into a pillar of salt, then we're going to ask, what does salt have to do with anything? So here's the backstory that the rabbis give us, that Lot came from the house of Abraham. He wanted to welcome these guests into his home because hospitality, as I told you, was an important value in the house of Abraham and Sarah. And he wanted his family members, his household, to participate in this mitzvah of hospitality. And so he asks his wife to bring them salt. Now, his wife is not, she has a more like Sodom kind of mindset, and she chastises him, she mocks him, and according to the Midrash, she says, do you even want to learn this bad habit from Avraham? Meaning this, what is this bad habit? Being hospitable to guests. Now, finally, she complies with her husband's request, but she sort of tricks him. What does she do? Because she wants to get these guests out of her house. She does not like them there. So she goes to her neighbors to borrow salt. And her neighbors say, why do you need salt? Why didn't you prepare enough salt for your family? And Lot's wife who I just told you her name is Edith, she says, "Oh, I took enough salt for our family, but now we have guests and it's for them that I need salt." You see how like deceptive that she is. So in this way, everybody around found out that Lot is took in guests into his house and they stormed the house and demand that he hand them over. We heard about that whole thing. So the idea is because she sinned through salt, she's punished by being turned into a pillar of salt. Isn't that fascinating? I think that that's fascinating. Okay, now there's two traditions of where this pillar of Lot's wife is today. One on, so there's in the Dead Sea area, Jordan is on one side and Israel is on the other. The um so the tradition is that she's obviously on the Israel side, but right next to something that is called Mount Sodom. And if you look up Lot's wife, you'll see one of them looks just kind of like a block of I really wish that I was a master of sharing my screen and stuff because um let me see if I can do this. Um can you see that? Yes? Okay. All right, so this is the one that is in Israel. Um, so it doesn't really look like much. It just looks like a pillar, but there is a tradition. I'm not going to show it to you because I don't actually think that it is the correct one, but there is one that you will see pictures of that looks much more like a human shape. It's more like tall and narrow, and um, that one is on the Jordanian side. So I don't know what the story is there. Um, but um anyway, I did find it fascinating um that there are these two traditions and this concept of why salt be there, so there was a purpose. Okay. So the rabbis say that Lot is somewhat more righteous than his wife because of this. This is how we get like an insight into her character. Um, because he grew up with Abraham and Sarah, but his time in Sodom has coarsened his character. And so there is a second less positive way of understanding his decision to offer his daughters to this raging mob that is trying to pound down his door. And that is um, the rabbis say that a man would usually allow himself to be killed in order to save his wife and children. And Lot was willing to allow the townspeople to abuse his daughters. And so God holds him accountable and says in response to this that the improper act that you intended to be done to your daughters, meaning forced intercourse with people they did not choose, it's going to happen to you. So here's the reversal. In the first event in Sodom, Lot's ready to force his daughters against their will to engage in relations with the townspeople. And in the second episode, which takes place at Sodom is history, and Lot's daughters engage in relations with him. So those acts of incest are considered punishment for Lot for his inappropriate behavior offering his daughters to the townspeople. Um, there's another opinion that the daughter's act of incest is also punishment for their father because he moved to Sodom because he was attracted by the immoral lifestyle and that he himself was sexually promiscuous. And he moved to Sodom so that he could engage in this behavior without it being shocking to the townspeople because everybody behaved that way. And so he was punished by his daughters engaging in intercourse with him. And not only that, but it is public knowledge, like it's right there in the Torah. In Genesis in Bereshit, chapter 19, verse 36, the two daughters of Lot came to be with child by their father. Um, so it's sort of he got let me say this, another thing to his detriment. There's another rabbinic view that he this is so gross, but I'm going to tell you anyway because we're all adults, that he secretly lusted after his daughters. And even though he was drunk when the first one, the older one, laid with him, he was sober when she got up. And despite what he knew about what had happened, he got drunk again the next night. And so that these are not like good personality qualities. In contrast, the rabbis treat the daughter sympathetically, that um, they are judged not for having committed incest because God knows what's in our hearts, that the daughter's true intent was not, they were not interested, and maybe they had to talk themselves into it or so. I don't know. Can you imagine the conversation between the two sisters about how they're going to do this? They have no sexual desire for their father, but they are trying to save the world from total devastation because they truly believe there is nobody left on planet Earth. And if they thought that the whole world had been destroyed, because that's what happened with the flood, right, 10 generations ago, they had, and they, wherever they were, they saw no living souls. So they didn't have the knowledge that we have that it was actually only Sodom that had been destroyed. And so God knew what their intention was, their good thoughts, and rewarded them for their actions. We already alluded to this, but there's another underlying reason for this sympathetic treatment of the daughters of Lot on the part of the rabbis, and that is from Ruth, who is from Moab, who is one of the sons, which, goes all the way back to Lot and his daughter on one hand, and all the way forward to the Mashiach from from the story of Ruth. And so um, there's another important woman that will come from this distasteful um, story, and that is Naamah. She is an Ammonite. She becomes one of the two, I think, non-Jewish wives of Shlomo HaMelech, of King Solomon, and she is the mother of Rechavam. Um, it's Rechiboam, I think that's what you call him. I'm not sure. Who inherits the throne after Shlomo. Okay, um, and so these two women they descend from the two sons that are born from this distasteful act. Okay, um, now there's also a midrash that Lot's daughters didn't have any wine. Where are they going to get wine from? There was a miracle that was performed for them in the cave in which they were hiding, where all this happened. Wine miraculously appeared. And this is a remez. I taught you that word a couple of weeks ago. It's a hint to a verse in the book of Yoel, in the book of Joel, chapter 4, verse 18. That's a reference to very far in the future, the world to come, the Messianic era, whatever. And in that day, the mountains shall drip with wine. So somehow, in a supernatural way, they had access to wine. Um, the other thing, and with after this, we'll go on to the next part of the story, but both of Lot's daughters became pregnant from being with their father one time. And that's, according to the rabbis, because their intentions really were pure. And they only had to be with him in this distasteful kind of way one time to ensure the continuity of the world. And that is a parallel to Ruth when she went down at night to the threshing floor to be with Boaz. They are acting from altruism. So Boaz is an old man, and Ruth is a relatively young woman when she goes, but she goes um, out of not out of like simple attraction or sexual desire, but out of a higher spiritual purpose. And the rabbis ascribe that also to the daughters of Lot. And as a result, they are not made to lie with their father multiple times. This may sound familiar to you because it is also the case that when Hagar was with Abraham, she also conceived the very first time that they were together. So that is a great transition to returning to the story of Hagar, which is repeats itself in this parsha, and I want to bring this to you. So when she runs away the initial time, she's expecting, she's already pregnant, but she miscarries that child. You remember that when she ran away, that she had a conversation with an angel, and the angel said, "Return to Sarah, your mistress, and you will have a child, and you will name him Yishmael." So she goes back and she conceives a second time. Theoretically, she is only the second time that she is with Abraham, and she does in fact give birth to Yishmael. Yishmael is 14 years older than Yitzhak. Okay, so when Yishmael is born, Abraham is 86, and when Yitzhak, Isaac, is born, he's 100. Okay, so that's the 14-year difference. In Genesis chapter 21, verses 9 and 10 talk about the birth of Yitzhak, the birth of Isaac, and that in verse 9, Sarah is very concerned about the negative influence of Ishmael on her son. Okay. And so the verse says, Sarah saw the son, meaning Ishmael, whom Hagar the Egyptian, who had born to Abraham, playing. Okay. And the rabbis differ as to what is the nature of this activity that Sarah's worried about. What does she see that concerns her? So there's a couple of, I think four, let's go through them, different opinions about what is Sarah picking up on in the household that makes her sure that this is a bad influence on her young son. So, in one opinion, Ishmael's engaging in idolatry. Sarah saw him building pagan altars and offering sacrifices, and that was a big concern of hers. The second opinion that he was raping women and mistreating them. So those are inappropriate sexual acts. So far we have idolatry and we have inappropriate sexual acts. In a third opinion, he's engaging in bloodshed. That here's the scene that according to one opinion, that Sarah sees that they are playing with bows and arrows, and that Yishmael is shooting arrows at Yitzhak. His real intention is to try to kill his little half brother. Um, but when Sarah calls them on it, he says, "I don't know what you're talking about. We're just playing." But these three types of behavior, idolatry, sexual relations, and murder, even though he didn't obviously murder him, are the three transgressions that the rabbis consider, I guess, for lack of a better word, cardinal sins, for which a person should be killed rather than transgress. So the very famous Torah teaching is if somebody puts a gun in your hand and says, you kill this third party or I'm going to kill you, you must give up your life for that. You are not allowed to kill in order to prevent your. There's a lot of things in Jewish life that you are actually allowed to transgress for the sake of preserving life. And I'll give you an example of that. That was just in the news last week when we had the riot and the pogrom in Amsterdam. Israel sent planes. So El Al does not typically fly on Shabbat, but there were about 2,500 Israelis in in Amsterdam that needed to be airlifted out, and Israel sent planes on Shabbat. Now, normally you would not fly on Shabbat, but it was a case of what we call in Hebrew pikuach nefesh, which is like preserving a life, saving a life, and for that purpose you can transgress Shabbat. However, these three things, idol worship, immoral sexual relations, and murder, you cannot, there's no excuse for that. You can't do those things even to preserve your own life. Okay. So the idea here that the picture that the rabbis are painting is that Yishmael is his behavior is so extreme that it's totally unacceptable in the spirit of Abraham and Sarah's home, in the spirit of Torah, in the spirit of which Sarah wants to raise her own child. Um, Now there's a totally different opinion that what his misdeed was came about regarding the question of inheritance. So when Yitzhak is born, everybody they make a big party. And everybody's very happy because it's a miracle because Sarah's 99 years old. And they are saying, oh, a son is born to Abraham. A son is born to Abraham. He's going to inherit. And in the in Torah law, the firstborn inherits a double portion. Yishmael, who is also the son of Abraham, hears this and um, claims that he's the firstborn and he's the one who's going to get a double portion. And I want you to remember this because at the end of this lesson, we're going to get back to how this issue is still at play today. It's in the newspaper today. I don't mean literally today, but in in the news today, in the relationship between Israel and the Arab nations, is this issue of who is the correct inheritor of Abraham. And so, in any case, whatever one of these opinions or all of them together, Sarah is now very concerned about the future of her lineage through her son. And so she goes to Abraham. This is chapter 21, verse 10, and she says, "Cast out that slave woman and her son, for the son of that slave shall not share in the inheritance with my son Yitzchak." And so, according to this opinion, the expulsion of Hagar and Yishmael was meant to clarify this issue that Yitzchak is the proper heir to Abraham and not Yishmael. Now, you know, because you probably have read this, that Abraham does expel them, but according to the rabbis, it's not a simple thing. He has difficulty parting from Hagar and Ishmael and sending them on their way. He does it because, despite his reluctance, God tells him, and this is possibly my very favorite verse in all of Torah, chapter 21, verse 12. And God said to Abraham, so he's trying, so here's the scenario. Sarah saying, get rid of them. And Abraham is feeling like, how can I throw out Hagar and Ishmael? These are, they're not your family, but they're my family. And God says to him, be not displeased concerning the lad. Again, they call him the lad. That's not a great translation because he is 27 years old. And concerning your handmaid, meaning Hagar, listen to this. Whatever Sarah tells you, hearken to her voice. In Hebrew, these hearken to her voice is Shema B'kolah. Listen to what she says. For an Isaac will be called your seed. Okay, so God is saying, all right, this might be hard for you, but you need to do this because Sarah knows that your proper lineage is going to come from Yitzchak and not from Yishmael. And what do we learn from this? One of the things that we learn is that Sarah's prophecy exceeds that even of Abraham. Now, Abraham's relationship with God is not a slouchy, casual relationship, right? There's many times in these Torah portions that they are in communication. But now, when Abraham is not sure what to do and he wants to do the right thing, God is saying, Shema b'kolah, hearken to her voice, listen to your wife. She knows what she's saying. This is what you have to do. So however reluctant he is, very early the next morning, Abraham writes a bill of divorce and he gives it to Hagar and he sends her away from him and from um, his household. And he stands to see, he wants to make sure that they at least have water with them. Um, and so he watches them as they're departing. And the rabbis say that once they come to the beginning of the wilderness, like where it's no longer settled area, Hagar begins to decline. If you remember last year, we talked about the story of Orpah, who is the sister of Ruth, and how after she goes on her journey, they're at a crossroads and she disappears and she has a tremendous spiritual decline. The same thing the rabbis are saying happened to Hagar. She begins to engage in the idolatry of her childhood, and the goat skin that was holding the water is now empty of water. Okay. And um, so that's sort of divine punishment for having strayed from worshiping the God of Abraham. This last week we talked about the 10 trials of Abraham. This is one of them, sending her away. In Genesis, now we're in chapter 21, verses 14 and 15. It talks about how Hagar is wandering around in the wilderness of Beersheba and the water's gone and Yishmael is parched. and she cannot bear to see him pass away. And so she leaves him under some desert bush somewhere. Um, there's one opinion that she puts him in the same place where the last time she had run away, the angel came to speak with her. And and in doing that, Hagar is hoping that God is going to help her. Even though she's just been busy worshiping idols, she's sort of hedging her bets. Like whoever's going to rescue her from this desperate situation, um, she's hoping for. Now, in verse 16, after she puts Yishmael under the bush, and the impression that we get is Yishmael is very weak at this point. He's either ill or he's dying of thirst, but he's definitely is not strong and hardy. She sits down some distance from him. And according to one opinion, she starts arguing with God and says, um, yes, not literally yesterday, but you told me, and this is Genesis 16, chapter verse 10, I will greatly increase your offspring, meaning Yishmael is going to be the father of a great nation. And now he's dying of thirst. So, I don't know what your story is here, God. So Hagar's prayer is answered, and you know this part of the story. God sends her an angel who shows her a well of water. Now, according to one opinion, God answered Hagar's prayer or her arguments in the merit of Abraham, but another tradition says that Yishmael was also praying, that and his prayers were answered. And the rabbis learned from this idea, I think is very significant, that when a person is sick or a person is in need, their own prayer is the more effective than all the prayers of other people. That doesn't mean that other people shouldn't pray for them, but when a person is in a difficult situation, they're in pain, they're sick, they are grieving, whatever they need, a spouse, they whatever they need, that their own prayer hits harder in a way than, and that makes sense because they're the ones who are lacking. They're the ones who are in need. They're the ones who need God's salvation the most. And so their prayers are stronger. But in any case, the angel does come and shows them where the water is. Um, and in verse 19, it says, God opened her eyes. The idea is that the well was there all the time, but she couldn't see it. And this is sort of an interesting metaphor, I think, for all of us, that sometimes what we need, we already have it, we just don't recognize it. That in the language of the rabbis, everyone is presumed to be blind until God opens their eyes. So there's a related idea in the Torah that God gives brings the I'm trying to translate it from Hebrew, brings the healing before the disease. Um, Now, what does that mean? It means that if God is going to afflict a person with something, the repair of that thing already exists in the world. And the best example I can give you for this is it hasn't happened yet. It's not going to happen for till the beginning of Shemot. But when the Israelite nation go into Egypt, and they are eventually going to be enslaved, and they're going to be enslaved for 210 years, and they are eventually going to be redeemed by Moshe, who is the son of Yocheved. In before they enter the gates of Egypt, Yocheved is born. Yocheved, who will ultimately give birth to the Redeemer, is born as they're entering Egypt. So that is the pathway for the solution for the problem already existed before the problem ever came. They weren't enslaved when they first came in. They were treated very well because Yosef was still alive. We're like months away from that. Um, Maybe not months, but at least weeks. Okay. So let's just continue on in we have a few minutes left. So Hagar, so the well appears, they both drink enough, they survive. And now the rabbis say that Hagar takes a wife for Ishmael, because remember, he's 27 years old. And where does he get the wife? Where does Hagar get the wife for Ishmael? From Egypt. Hagar was, I told you last week, In one opinion, she was the daughter of the Egyptian Pharaoh, but in any case, she was Egyptian, and she returns to her roots by selecting a wife for her son from Egypt. Now, according to the rabbis, Abraham sent them away, but he didn't break off all contact with them. And he came to visit their home a number of times. He continued to be involved in their lives and to guide Ishmael as best he could, even though he wasn't part of his household anymore. So, um, Abraham goes to visit, and he goes to wherever they're living, and he finds Ishmael's wife, and he says, "Where is Ishmael?" And she says, "Oh, he and his mother, meaning Hagar, went to bring some fruit and dates from the wilderness. They're not home right now." And so Abraham says, "Please give me some bread and water because I've been traveling." I'm paraphrasing. "I've been traveling through the wilderness. I need some bread and water." And she says, "I have neither bread nor water." Not a very hospitable response. And he says, when Ishmael comes home, I want you to give him this message. I want you to tell him that an old man came from the land of Canaan to see you. And he said, quote, change the threshold of your house, which is not good for you. That is code for, well, I'll tell you, Ishmael comes back from whatever little journey he was on with his mother, and the wife delivers the message, and Ishmael understood that the message was, this is not a suitable wife. She was not hospitable. I came a long way to see you, and she didn't even give me bread or water. You need to divorce her. That was sort of the implied message. Ishmael understood the message. He divorced her, and he got a second wife. 3 years later, Abraham comes to visit again, and he arrives at midday, and he finds Ishmael's second wife at home, and he asks her, "Where is Ishmael?" And she said, "Oh, he and his mother went to herd the camels in the wilderness." And he says, sound familiar? "Please give me some bread and water because I'm tired from the rigors of the journey through the wilderness." And she brings him bread and water. And there he stands and he prays to God that the house of Ishmael should be filled with bracha, with blessing. When Ishmael comes back, his wife says, "What happened?" And he understood that even though he wasn't living with his father, that his father still cared about him, still had mercy on him, and on his children. And so Abraham is presented as continuing to guide Ishmael in the right path, even though they were expelled from the house. And Ishmael's success is seen as resulting from this blessing that Abraham gives him. Now, here's another little piece that I find really fascinating. In chapter 25, verse 1, it says that after Sarah dies, related to the outcome. There's so much, so much to pack in here. But after Sarah dies, Abraham takes another wife, and her name is Keturah. The In most opinions, Keturah is Hagar. That the rabbis maintain that after Sarah died, Abraham basically remarries Hagar, and one explanation is that Hagar has improved her relationship with God. She doesn't worship idols. She's not impacted by all of that stuff, and she has never remarried. She's never been with another man, and so Abraham brings her back. And in general, she is considered at the end of the story in a positive way. Okay. There's a Hebrew, keturah sounds like ketoret. Ketoret is the Hebrew word for incense. It is the incense that was burned in the temple. Okay. So people say that she was called keturah because she was perfumed with mitzvot, with good deeds, and because her deeds were as fine as the incense, the ketoret. You hear the thing? Very fascinating. I'm just doing this off the top of my head. I didn't have notes on this, but there's a tradition that they had, I believe, six additional sons together who were not, they're not Jews. They don't come through the line of Isaac, of Yitzhak. But where are they? The tradition is that they were sent to the east. These are sons of Abraham who were sent to the east. Now, the east, think India, think China, think like the aspects of the cultures of the East have certain Jewish Torah concepts that are descended from, because they are, in fact, all children of Abraham. So it's not the line that will become the Jewish people. It's not the Israelites, but they are children of Abraham, and they do bring some of the wisdom, the Abrahamic wisdom, if you will, the universal wisdom to the East. Um, and there's a lot more to say about that. But I just want to end with this idea that the rabbis emphasize that the descendants of Hagar, especially Ishmael, are meant to be, I want to be it's a little political, but subordinated to the descendants of Sarah, who is Yitzchak and the Israelites and ultimately the Jewish people. Notwithstanding this um, sort of eternal reality, the offspring of Ishmael continue to pose this danger to Israel for a very long time. This is not like this is going all the way back to the biblical basis of it, because they never stopped demanding Abraham's inheritance. What we see happening in the news today, the fact that the um, the way that the Jewish people being back in the land of Israel is such a problem. It's a spiritual problem to the descendants of Ishmael, goes all the way back to this. If you look at a map, and I'm sure you guys know this, but if you look at a map of this region, Israel is a tiny, tiny, tiny little sliver of the landmass that is occupied by the descendants of Abraham, most of them from the Ishmael side. But they are so, it's like eh, embedded in their bones, embedded in their thinking that that the 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 cousins, the descendants of Yitzhak, have no place in this, that they are the true inheritors. And that is sort of the what the thought I want to leave you with, the biblical precedent or the biblical. I'm not saying that they necessarily know this, by the way, but the rabbis say this is what inflames them. This is what animates them. This is why they never stop demanding that this land belongs to them, because it goes all the way back to the dispute between Yitzchak and Yishmael about whose land is it anyway. Okay, we are 3 minutes before the end, so I will open up and ask, do any of you have any questions or comments? If you want, you can just unmute yourself and speak, but that is what I prepared for you.
Rivka.
Yes, Valerie.
I think it's a lot of Christians don't know the stories that you're telling, which are invaluable to helping understand the Torah. Um, and a quick read on a lot of that is in what's called the Book of Jasher, and you can find it on the internet. It's the long one, not the 17-page one or something. But also in verification of the fact that a lot of people believe that the Jews have just made up all these stories, but they hold that the whole Tanakh is inspired by God. And in Ezekiel chapter 16, verse 49, it's very interesting. And from a Christian perspective, it's very interesting because everybody's taught that the whole problem with Sodom and Gomorrah was just the sexual sin. But Ezekiel 16:49 says, hang on just a second, I pulled it up. It says, behold, this was the iniquity of thy sister Sodom. Pride, fullness of bread, and abundance of idleness was in her and in her daughters. Neither did she strengthen the hand of the poor and needy. And it goes on, and it basically tells you that it's because there was no justice, which is the stories of like Eliezer going down there and testing their judicial system, and that was ridiculous. And the people didn't give each other food, and they starved people in the streets, and the hospitality things that you were talking about. So there's actually, the prophets actually are commenting on it, which means that those stories are certainly older than the prophets in order for the prophets to be able to be quoting them. So further justification for the fact that these stories didn't just develop recently. These are ancient, ancient, ancient stories. So just comment.
So what you're sort of tapping into is number one, what motivates me to do this, which is I know that Christians know the basic Bible story, and with a layer that I'm trying to add is the rabbinic tradition and the backstory. But in order for you to sit here with me, you have to either believe what you just said, that there's a divinity to, or there's a legitimacy to these rabbinic traditions. They're not just like things that the traditions of men or whatever Christians
Mhm.
say. But also, um, or you have to be able to set aside your skepticism enough to hear me, and the truth is that what I bring to you is a fraction of what's out there, because we only have an hour a week to talk about the stories, and I only focus on part of the stories, part of the parshiot. But what I appreciate, I don't know if this is uncomfortable for some of you, depending on what your background is and what you were taught about the oral Torah and about the rabbinic tradition, and if it's not literally, in the words of the Tanakh, then I'm not buying it. Like that, I know that there are many people that hold like that. So I think it's very brave of you to be open to hearing a legitimate, an authentic Jewish perspective, whether you accept it or not. That's between you and Hashem. But for many people coming from a Christian background, they're not even interested. They don't even want to hear this, because if I can't show them a verse in Tanakh that backs up a story, they're like any of the stories that I share today. If I can't show them a verse, then they can't take it in. So you guys are
Well, there's even an extra point in that. It's like some of the information that's given in the New Testament. Just as an example, in the book of Acts in the New Testament, it gives the name of two of the magicians who opposed Moses before Pharaoh as
Mhm.
Jannes and Jambres, but it doesn't tell their names in scripture. When it tells you that Abraham was, 70, or I'm sorry, when they went to Egypt, there was 70 people, and the New Testament gives another number. Well, the other number is found in the Oral Torah, and it's because they were counted twice, like, and so, and one of them left out whatever. I mean, like, you can see
Yeah, there are
this.
different counts. Yeah.
Yeah, you can see the stories in the actual history of the counting in the Jewish text, not in the Christian text, but the Christian text was quoting the one that wasn't the Bible. So the there's lots of evidence. So if anybody that's listening to you is still skeptical about whether or not the traditional stories that you're telling are, approved by God, well, then why were the prophets? And for those of you who still, are you know uh, still in Christianity, like, even the New Testament supports it.
Right.
So
And I don't think any of us, I mean, you wouldn't be coming back to hear me. Like right? But I just know that that attitude is there. So I just want to say, Teresa said, I absolutely love that we're learning the backstory and rabbinical traditions, because it fills in the missing puzzle pieces. And that
Exactly.
is so much my goal, is
Mhm.
to show you how rich. And um, I wish that I could give you, like, what I'm showing you is like let's say level one is like the pshat, the simple meaning of the text, and I'm showing you like level two or three, but really, like, uh, what's available in terms of Torah commentary and Hebrew, and why it says this word and why it says this word, all that stuff, that's like, like level 10. We're not going to level 10 together. I'm not capable of teaching it. And I think I don't want to lose you, so I'm just going like one level deeper or two levels deeper than what you have had before, to give you the sense that the way Jews study Bible adds so much richness to the stories. And so, all right, we are out of time. I'm gonna finish up and end the class, but I'm always happy to hear from you in the group. And thank you again, all of you. And just a reminder again, next week I will not be with you. And so I wish you a good 2 weeks, and you can always reach me on WhatsApp. Bye,
Bye.
guys. Good to see all of
Thank
you.
you.
Thanks for
Bye-bye.
coming. Bye.